Okay, so we're going to shift and talk about the obligations of the buyer. It's a bit more concise than the corresponding obligations of the seller. And then we will talk about buyer's remedies and seller's remedies after breach. All right. So in your typical transaction where the buyer is paying cash for goods, the buyer's main obligation is to pay for your stuff according to the terms of the contract, which can mean payment at the time of delivery. It can mean payment, if it's invoiced within 30 days. It can mean payment according to the credit terms if offered by the seller. All right. Of course, the default rule is that payment is due when the goods are made available by the seller, are tendered. All right. The buyer can have an opportunity to inspect the goods prior to payment. For goods that are easily inspected, this makes sense. Anticipatory repudiation. All right. As it relates to the buyer, this is the seller saying that we're not going to be able to deliver the goods we promised. All right. Well, in that case, the buyer has options. They can treat that communication from the seller as a breach, and they'll have some options, and we'll talk about the options. But they amount to treating it as a breach and suing for damages, or waiting and seeing, right? You can also cover, which is get whatever you contracted for from another party, and if it costs more, then holding the seller, the breaching party, liable for the differential. Again, just another visual representation of what we just discussed. And so I'll leave this in here as well. Okay, that's it for chapter 14. Okay, so remedies. When the buyer has breached, if the buyer has breached before the goods are delivered, just cancel the contract. All right. That's the most basic remedy, and typically doesn't require court intervention. All right. If the seller still intends to complete the transaction, or the buyer has expressed interest in completing the transaction, withhold delivery. All right. Say, okay, we've set your goods aside. We're waiting for payment. Once you pay, then we will deliver the goods. Resell goods, and if they sell for less, the differential is damages. All right. In other words, find another buyer. And if because of the time frame or the circumstances, the goods sell for less, then the differential is damages. And the seller and the original buyer is obligated to pay. All right. Sue to recover purchase price. If that happens, seller still has to tender the goods. All right. Sue to recover damages. So these are things that there may be lost profits, Um, Consequential damages. If the seller was delivering goods to the buyer, if the contract called for that, the cost of transporting the goods would be a consequential damage, right? So that the buyer could be obligated to pay for that. If the goods have already been delivered, reclaim the goods. Sue to reclaim the goods if the buyer isn't willing to surrender the goods. Buyer's remedies, and there's some similarities. If the seller refuses to deliver, cancel the contract. Right? And that probably is the most common. If the goods exist and are in the possession of a third party, and the seller is insolvent, sue to obtain the goods from the third party. Specific performance, which is probably the least common of the remedies on this list. You're asking a court to compel the buyer to do what they agreed to do, right? And this one is rare just because oftentimes there's a reason that a party breached, so specific performance may not be the best remedy in all cases. But it's an equitable remedy where you have the court say, you know what, I don't need damages, I just need the seller to do what they contractually agreed to do. And that's specific performance. Covered and recover damages. This means you get whatever you were buying from the buyer or whatever you were buying from the seller from another seller. And if it costs more, that's your measure of damages. All right. Sue and recover if goods are being held by a third party. And so I kind of overlapped. I think I used that description for number 2. So the difference between 2 and 5 is that in number 2, the goods are being held by the seller who's insolvent. In number 5, the goods are being held by a third party. Right? And 6 is sue for damages, and these can be consequential damages or compensatory damages. An example of compensatory would be similar to the cover, right? If I had to get the if let's say we're still talking about the 500 chickens. So poultry farmer doesn't show up on Friday with the chickens that I need for the weekend. All right. And I needed 500, and so when the poultry farmer doesn't show up, I call another poultry farm, but they're only able to deliver 200 chickens and at a higher cost per chicken. Well, the higher cost is a compensatory damage because it cost me more to get some of what I contracted for. And I've only got 200 chickens. So the reality is that at some point over the weekend, I'm going to run out of chicken. All right. And that's going to result in lost profits. All right. Which would be a consequence of the breach, the seller's refusal to deliver. And I can sue for lost profits as a consequential damage. All right. So those are options available to the buyer.